Hi, and welcome to the Red Team Draft Podcast. I am your host, Alex West, and I'm joined today by the full complement. The holidays are over. Well, the holiday is over. The whole team is in the house. So let's go around and meet everybody. First, let me start with our executive producer, Eustacchio Raulli. Follow him on Twitter at EVR1022. What's up, Eustacchio?
Not too much. Doing good.
And we are also joined by our prodigy, the man himself, Mr. Connor Harr. Follow him on Twitter at Harr. Connor, what up, Connor?
How you doing, man? It's good to have the whole family back together.
The gang is back, and we're ready. And we can't forget, last but not least, Mr. Josh Earl. Follow him at 2RedJEarl on Twitter. Josh, how is everything, man?
Doing well, my friend.
I went for like the quiet, smooth jazz radio.
Yeah,
voice
it worked. It worked.
Hey, man, what's up?
Hello.
All right, so this is week number 6 for us, and we're rolling today. First of all, top of the program, a brief note to talk about. Darius Garland, freshman who was sort of projected to be a lottery pick, tore his meniscus. He's going to miss the rest of the season. Now, that's a big news story. That's something that we wanted to look into. We have decided that instead of giving you the quick breakdown this week, we're going to take some time and we're going to go back and look over his body of work, and we're going to look over a couple other things. And that's something we're going to touch on a little bit more heavily next week. So we are aware of that. And it is important to us. We just want to be able to look at everything that Garland brought to the table and what few games that he played, and then be able to, sort of kick that down the road to next week and talk about it a little bit more intelligently. But for tonight, really interesting topic, something that we discussed all week and we kind of kicked around and we really liked it. So we're going to do a little postmortem on the 2009 draft, the NBA draft, which kicked off with the first pick as Blake Griffin, of course, James Harden, Steph Curry, DeMar DeRozan, Drew Holiday, Jeff Teague, a ton of role players. This is a draft that's really interesting for a lot of reasons because it could have gone a lot of different directions. Things could have gone very differently, for the Timberwolves or for the Warriors for that matter. So we decided that we're going to take this draft, we're going to break it down a little bit. And to start us off, if you haven't been reading Draft Thoughts on the 94, first of all, get it together. Second of all, Eustacchio touched on Blake Griffin earlier this month, I believe. Was that right, Eustacchio?
Yeah, a couple weeks ago.
Okay, he touched on Blake Griffin earlier this month, and he explored how Griffin was the right choice. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I don't want to say he's the right choice, but he may have not have been the best player, but at the time he still looked like the best choice. And maybe even he was the best choice based on what we knew about him, that other players needed more development. So let's start with Blake Griffin, and then let's kind of dissect this entire draft, guys. What do you think?
Sounds good.
All right. Give it to us, Eustacchio.
So in my column a couple weeks ago, entitled Blake Griffin and the Right Questions, I went back and took a look at that selection, which I've always found fascinating. Griffin was just an outstanding prospect. He was a big man that could do everything. He could jump out of the gym. He could handle the ball like a guard. He was a fantastic passer. And there was really no weakness in his game. He was the consensus #1 pick for a reason, but at the same time, that scouts may have locked in on him a little bit because of how much he was a walking highlight, really. But because of that, there may have been there was an opportunity cost that may have been overlooked. And so what I delved into is, were we asking the right questions about Blake Griffin at the time? Were we looking ahead to where the league was heading? How his skill set would fit into that? How would he develop long-term? And as we've seen throughout his career, Griffin was fantastic from the outset. He won Rookie of the Year, 6 straight Rookie of the Month awards, All-NBA his second and third year, but he never really got a whole lot better. He started out as a top 20 player in the league, peaked maybe at around top 10, but he never became that game-changing force. Whereas 2 players from that draft class, James Harden and Steph Curry, went on to become historically great guards. And so could we have foreseen that is something that I wanted to look a little bit more at, and how we can ask the right questions about this draft class and not make the same mistakes.
Yeah, I think you make some really good points about Blake and about asking the right question. And I think naturally it sort of lends itself to the next question, because when you look at this class behind Blake Griffin, you see two names that jump out to me in particular are James Harden and Steph Curry. Steph Curry might be one of the most game warping players to come into the league in a long time. He kind of changed how we understood gravity. He kind of changed how we understood floor spacing, a lot of things. I mean, he really impacted how the sport of basketball is played this today. Like Josh said, we were talking about it. He said that you see kids shooting 30-footers. And this is the kind of thing that, you can't predict. And I think that's a really good point about this is you can't predict the impact that Steph Curry had on the would have. You could predict that he's going to be a good player. You could predict that he's going to be an impactful player. But I don't think anybody standing in 2009 thought that Steph Curry would change how we look at the league. And I think that it lends itself to this question. And Josh, I want to kick it to you on this one. Is it fair to ask is it fair to sort of rehash a draft, knowing what we know about these guys that are these black swans that sort of stand out on their own? Is it fair to look back and say, well, okay, how did Curry fall to 7th? Or how did you take Hasheem Thabeet over James Harden when we really didn't know how great what these players were capable of? I mean, naturally, it's okay to say you should have taken James Harden over Thabeet because people were saying that at the time. But, like Curry fell to 7th, but where was the sign that Steph Curry was going to absolutely change the game? So is that fair, Josh?
Yeah, I think it's fair to try to ask questions about how certain players and certain skill sets will progress going forward and how that might impact the league going forward. That said, like you alluded to, Steph is kind of like a black swan event, which is basically a completely rare and unpredictable event that it'd be pretty much impossible to have predicted at the time that Steph Curry was going to change the entire way the game's played, going to change the entire way that people perceive the game, that our young players approach the game nowadays, even how fellow NBA players are playing subsequently. Kemba Walker shooting over 10 threes a game nowadays, kind of following Steph's footprints. And those black swan events, by their very nature, are practically impossible to prepare for and expect. But I do think you can gauge how trends might be shifting, and you can kind of get some sense of how certain skill sets might be benefited or reduced, given a potential kind of shift in how the game is played or approached in the NBA level. So it's one of those complicated questions where I think on one level you can kind of focus in on trying to forecast likely trends and how the players in that draft class might have career outcomes in that regard. But the prediction of black swan events like Steph Curry becoming this transcendental impact player in the game of basketball, to sound kind of like Bill Walton. But we can't necessarily predict that, but we should be asking questions about how the league is trending.
Okay, Connor, I know that you did a lot of research on this. You looked into this and sort of building off the back of what Josh said. We're talking about trying to maximize players. Predicting players is very hard. I think one of the things that we want to look at is maximizing players. And I know that you did a lot of research on pace, particularly in regards to this top 10. Break down for us a little bit of what the numbers showed you as you looked through this draft in particular.
Yeah, I would think that the reason why most people would feel like a big factor contributing to Harden and Curry's success over their careers is partially how the game's changed so much since they've been drafted. So basically, what I did was I felt like one of the biggest differences was the pace of play over the course of the past from 2009 till now. So what I did was I took the league average pace every season, and from 2009 up until the 2013 season, the pace kind of just stagnated a little bit in the low 90s, topping out at 92.7 actually in the 2009-10 season, which Blake Griffin wasn't actually healthy for, but assuming like if he was, that was what the Clippers were anticipating him to do in his rookie season. So from there, I saw the change sort of shift in 2012 to 2013. And that season, 8 teams that made the playoffs were top 10 in pace. So from there, after that season, where 8 teams made the playoffs in the top 10 in pace, we saw the pace spike a lot higher than it normally does, almost by 2 points, where it went from 92.0 to 93.9. After that, you saw 4 teams make the playoffs that were top 10 in pace. After that, I think the league trend kind of stagnated a little bit up until the Warriors' first successful season, when you could argue their most successful season, when they won their first title in 2014-15. Probably not their first title overall, but their first title in a while at least. So at that point, the pace started to pick up again. So where I went from the pace after that was I took Blake Griffin's win shares and his box plus minus per for every season he played relatively healthy, other than last season when he was shifting towards teams. So I took his win shares, his box plus minuses, and came up with what pace he played each season, and sort of came up with like an average pace where you could sort of maximize Griffin's potential from his best seasons in terms of box plus minus and win shares. And at that, I ended up with about a 94 to 96 pace, which would be which is one of the lowest in the league if you go to last season. But also teams did have success at that pace last season, like the Spurs, Heat, and Jazz were all relatively close to that pace. So one of the things that I sort of tried to look at, but I didn't have enough time, was I wanted to see how teams were able to still maximize that talent at that pace, particularly with a strong post player like the Spurs did last season with LaMarcus Aldridge.
We've talked about how we talked about Blake Griffin. We've talked about pace. Now, I think the natural way to just sort of progress this discussion is let's get in there and let's discuss the specifics. We've done the methodology. We've broken down, okay, this is what happened. Were we asking the right questions? Let's just break this down pick by pick. So let's go through the top 10 really quickly, and then I know that there are quite a few notables who fall outside of the top 10 in this draft. So let's talk about this and say, I'm putting this to the whole group, and I really want you guys to engage in this discussion. Is Blake Griffin the right pick here? You're sitting at number one. Now, without the benefit of knowing who Steph Curry is, yeah, sure, it's easy to say, redraft, you take Curry 1 and Harden 2, whatever. But without the benefit of those things, you're looking at Blake Griffin, this prolific player out of Oklahoma. Is that the right choice?
If you're the Clippers at that time, yes.
Okay. What situation where you see where Blake Griffin's not the right choice, Josh?
If you already have a pretty solid all-star style front court in place, then Blake would introduce some redundancies, and in that type of circumstance, one of the many point guards or guards that were taken in this draft class would have made perhaps more sense.
Okay.
But given the highlight reel factor about Blake's game that Eustacchio noted, given the fact, and this is somewhat hindsight bias, but we know how funny Blake is. We know how good Blake is as like a spokesman and stuff. Given all of that, if you are in LA and you're the ugly stepchild, younger sibling of the Lakers in LA, and you've been horrible for a long time, Blake makes a lot of sense both on the court and off.
All right, guys, sort of corroborate that. I mean, Eustacchio, we know that you said that he was the pick that you think was correct, but were they asking the right questions?
Yeah.
Is that your thought?
I think it's completely understandable to take Blake Griffin number 1 there. There were a lot of reasons in support of that, and he wasn't a bad pick by any means. Like if you compare him to the number 1 pick the next year, John Wall, I mean, they're pretty even as far as their careers. But at the same time, I do think there were reasons for Harden and Curry to at least make the short list or to be considered for that pick. I think that if you look back at Curry's college career, his sophomore year, he's the only one of 2 sophomores in history to take more than 300 3-pointers and to shoot better than 40% on them. So just for reference, he was taking about 10 3-pointers a game, and he was doing this while playing 32 minutes per game, which works out to about 55 possessions. So 10 3-point attempts on 55 possessions. That's a very high rate of launching triples. He was historically unique in an important facet of the game, and examining the potential of that should have gotten him more attention near the top of the draft, whether it's at the number 1 pick or in number 2, number 3. There was definitely something there to, you could see the framework of something unique in his profile. And then if you look at James Harden, he was in the top 3% in the country in usage, in true shooting percentage, in assist rate. That's a trifecta that leads to great offense on both an individual and a team level. And even at Arizona State, you could see the beginnings of a Morey ball shot profile. Honestly, that may have more to do with James Harden than Daryl Morey. It was evident in his teams at every level because he controlled the ball. He took those efficient shots and set up his teammates for similarly efficient shots.
Okay, let's go on and talk about number 2. I think this is the most interesting selection. The Grizzlies take Hashim Thabit. All right. I'm looking back at the Grizzlies roster, the 08-09 roster. They went 24-58, and their top four or 5 players were OJ Mayo, Rudy Gay, Marc Gasol, Mike Conley. Now, in that offseason, they add Zach Randolph into the mix. And they bring back a team who the next season is going to be led by Rudy Gay, OJ Mayo, Zach Randolph, Marc Gasol, and Mike Conley. Guys, I'm looking at this roster, and maybe it's hindsight bias, and maybe it's that I didn't think Hashim Thabit was that good to begin with. But what do you look at when you see this roster that already has 2 quality big men that makes you think we need to add Hashim Thabit to this? Is it that he represents the highest upside? Is it that big men were a commodity? Because to me, and I mean, I'm not really. James Harden was the 3rd pick in the draft, and he was a 2-guard. This is a team that very evidently needed a 2-guard. So somebody's going to have to walk me through this one.
So part of it was at the time, bigs were much more in vogue. They were much more important to a roster. And you also have to factor in that there were some teams that just had massive size advantages. That I don't think the Lakers. The Lakers had already acquired Pau Gasol to join. Lamar Odom, and I don't recall if they had Bynum at the time. I don't think they did, but they might have. I failed to recall, but to compete against some of these premier teams that had a lot of size and a lot of depth of size, while I disagree with taking the beat there, I can see the potential logic that they might have been working with. Although I will tell you I have a story behind the scenes about this whole decision, but I'll save that until we get through things a little bit because it has ramifications throughout the draft.
Okay. I honestly can't think of a better transition to this because I'm not going to steal your thunder, but it has to do with the next pick. Your story does. And the next pick was James Harden. So the beat's gone. He's off the board. We obviously sort of disagree with that pick. Even in context of the time, it seems weird. Yes, you have bigs in vogue, but also I'm not sure why you don't fill the position that you need. I don't know what it is that puts the beat higher, but he did come in and average a whopping 3.1 points and 3.6 rebounds in that first season. So, I guess it was served correctly. But anyway, James Harden goes number 3 to the Oklahoma City Thunder, who already had Russell Westbrook. They already had Kevin Durant, and they added James Harden to this group. Now, Josh, give us the story.
So I've heard this from multiple inside sources. The beat was actually higher on the Thunder's big board than Harden. If Memphis had not taken the beat, they would have taken the beat over Harden. Also, in regards to the Thabit selection, since we're having a hard time wrapping our minds around that, also through multiple sources, I've heard that the coaching staff and the scouting staff highly wanted Steph Curry at number 2 that year. The problem was the owner wanted the beat, and ultimately speaking, the owner is the one that writes the checks, and the owner is the one that has the final say. And so the beat was the pick, which is caused kind of a domino effect, leaving Harden to be the choice for the Thunder, leaving Steph still on the board to subsequently be passed over by Sacramento and Minnesota twice. But yeah, that the beat pick kind of set a series of dominoes in play that could have resulted in not only a very different draft class, but complete ramifications for the entire league as we know it, depending on where Harden and Steph would have wound up.
And I think probably naturally it would lead you to believe that, okay, Griffin goes first, Curry goes second in this regard, the beat goes third. The Kings took a shooting guard or sort of a combo guard out of Memphis and Tyreke Evans, and Evans was a good player, but he was ball dominant. To me, I think naturally that's probably where you slot Harden, because I thought Harden coming out of Arizona State was just a better version of what Evans was.
Yes.
He was a bigger body. He was very strong. He wasn't cut. He didn't quite have the bulk that he has now, but he was still a guy who had shown himself, acquitted himself nicely as a ball handler, as sort of a combo guard, as a guy who could score. So I think naturally you probably would look at it and go, Sacramento takes Harden there. So imagine a world where Blake Griffin plays for the Clippers. Okay, we know that world. Steph Curry plays for the Memphis Grizzlies. Hasheem Thabit goes to the Oklahoma City Thunder. Maybe, who knows what that has to do with the 2012 title. Who knows what happens with this Warriors dynasty. And who knows if the Sacramento Kings don't pull out of a tailspin with a player who had potential to be a franchise player in James Harden earlier on. What a bizarre set of circumstances that leads us to number 5 with Ricky Rubio. Connor, Ricky Rubio at number 5. Ricky Rubio, international prospect. You're a guy, you do a lot of international scouting, got a lot of insight on this. Rubio had some pretty evident flaws even at the time, but he's acquitted himself nicely. He's had a really nice NBA career. Is this the right pick in context for the Minnesota Timberwolves? And then sort of, where do you go from here with Ricky Rubio? If he is the right choice, where do you go from here as a Minnesota?
Yeah, so I'm kind of trying to pull this up now to see who was actually on the board at the time.
Well, you got Steph Curry, you got DeMar DeRozan, you got Brandon
Okay,
Jennings.
I wasn't sure if we said Curry was
No.
was two
I
or
mean,
not.
that's a beautiful metaphorical world, but let's look at the
Right.
draft as it is. You've got Ricky Rubio. Rubio had been impressive. He'd been playing professionally since he was 14 years old.
Right.
With that pedigree, and even taking into benefit like what we know about a guy like Luka Doncic now, like Doncic played tremendously well in this league. Does this give him a step up when you look at a player like Ricky Rubio? Not necessarily specifically Ricky Rubio, but when you see a guy who played professionally in Europe in one of the best leagues in the world this early, how do you scout this guy in regards to comparing him to his other NCAA equivalents?
Yeah. Honestly, I think at the time we're probably looking at a little bit of a difference in depth of international competition as it was then to what it is now. I feel like sort of as the time went on, international competition sort of grown a lot more. So I think that a lot of game film or footage, whatever you were scouting him from, sort of could have been taken a little bit lightly than someone would say like a EuroLeague now would, where we're talking about no doubt, without a question, the second best basketball competition in the world. And I think that with the Timberwolves sort of selecting Rubio, it said to me that they were crying out for a playmaker. So with their roster that they had, it doesn't look like they really had anybody that was really going to be doing any real playmaking or passing with the ball. So I think that was kind of what they were hoping for in Rubio. Maybe not necessarily taking into account his defensive flaws. And I think that at the time too, Steph Curry probably wasn't really billed as much of a playmaker as people know that he is now. So I think you're kind of looking at two undersized guards, one that shoots it really well, and we're not quite sure what to do with the really shooting it really well. And since shooting off movement wasn't like a huge value at the time, and another one that just is a really good creative handler that playmakes and can spread the ball around to the rest of the team. So I think that that's something that you can take into account. There's sort of like a justification of taking Rubio.
Yeah, I think that what we had seen in the 2008 Olympics, this is a kid who's 18 years old. He didn't play a ton of minutes, but he really showed some flash. He really showed like he belonged. And I think that probably maybe bumped his stock up a little bit more than what it should have been. But Rubio had a fantastic body of work already as a player. And I think that's something that gets a little bit undervalued from time to time, even though, like you said, and I will yield the point that the EuroLeague probably wasn't as good 10 years ago as it is now. The international scene has certainly developed a little bit more, but I do think that buoyed him a little bit. I think there's another follow-up question. Eustacchio, I'm going to kick this one to you. If Ricky Rubio showed up this year, Spanish prospect, 18 years old, wonderful passer, guy with a lot of vision, where does he fall in the 2019 class because of his inability to shoot?
It's an interesting question. Lack of shooting from a perimeter player can almost be a death knell to a player's stock today. But at the same time, I think someone like Rubio, who with so many accomplishments that young and such gifted passing, ball handling ability, and he's become a great defender as well. I think that there's still a place for him in the league today. If you're going to have a perimeter player that can't shoot, I think they need to be that primary ball handler, because then you're still have a lot of options available to you as an offense. If they're off the ball, they're not really doing anything, but with the ball in their hands, and he's a very ball dominant player, so he'd be handling it the majority of the offensive possessions he's on the floor. There's still a place for that in the league today, where you can have a top 10 offensive rating around a player like that. Where would he rank in this class? I feel like he would still be a top 10 player, but more on the fringe, not number 5, maybe 8, 9, 10 range is where he'd start to come into play, because there is a limited ceiling without his shooting. But he had a super solid profile all the way around, and there's not a lot of risk with a player like him.
Josh, do you sort of concur with that?
Yeah, particularly what Eustacchio said about you can get away with a perimeter player being subpar in terms of shooting threat to the defense if they're primarily on ball, because then you have the opportunity to put spacing around them. And by giving the ball in their hands, you're going to have some issues with teams going under the picks and that sort of thing. But by putting the ball in their hands, you actually reduce the issue of poor shooting, because they're not going to be cramping the space of their teammates because they're on ball. It's kind of what works so well with Giannis, for instance. Giannis still isn't a particularly good shooter, but if you put him on ball and you surround him with shooters, that doesn't really become an issue for the lineup as a whole. So yeah, I completely agree in that regard. And with Ricky's successes at that point in time, and actually he's a better defender than thought of. I kind of agree with the range that Eustacchio said.
He bulked up a lot. I think that as he's grown up, he's added a lot of mass, which helps him defend a little bit better. So next one, let's move on really quickly. Josh, I'm going to ask you this. Do you think Jonny Flynn got drafted because of that 6 overtime game?
Yes.
All right, on to Steph Curry. That is enough.
Although I do want to say people are way too harsh on Johnny.
Okay. Give us your Jonny Flynn defense.
So first off, Jonny Flynn in college was primarily successful working out of the pick and roll. Okay. He gets drafted by a team that just with the pick before him drafted their point guard of the future. So he gets drafted to play the point guard position with his successor drafted a pick in front of him. He's primarily successful in pick and roll, yet he's drafted by a team that's about to implement the triangle offense, which very generally does not have many pick and rolls and kind of de-emphasizes the point guard. So you're talking about making the adjustment from college to the NBA at arguably the hardest position to make that adjustment to, in a system that is the exact opposite of what works for you. And you're playing for the Timberwolves. So I think we got to give Johnny a little bit of a cushion here. And then it didn't help that he had the hip injury, which if any of you guys have ever had any sort of injury to your hip or something, it really screws with you, especially in a game like basketball. So while I wasn't a big fan of Jonny Flynn, I think he sometimes gets too much negativity thrown his way when a lot of that wasn't under his control. And I think Connor's got a point on this.
Go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a Jonny Flynn defense, but
this episode is going to be called the Jonny Flynn defense, by the way.
But basically, what I'm kind of hearing from some of the picks that we haven't liked, sort of with Flynn and the beat, which I kind of thought of when we were talking about the beat, is it seems like there's sort of it's more of like an organizational disconnection when you talk about nobody wanting the beat and like the coaching staff or the scouting team, but the owner decides that he wants the beat because he's probably big, tall, jumps high, and is pretty athletic for his size. And then we're talking about sort of a disconnect here where you're drafting not one but 2 point guards, which is just a mistake in general, but overlooking that because there's probably differences where it can actually work out. But with you actually going back to implement the triangle, I don't know if there was a coaching change made there or what, But if the coaching change was made there, they probably should have figured out that we don't want a coach that's going to run the triangle, that won't emphasize who our two lottery picks, two top 10 picks that we just took are.
There was a coaching change, by the way. They went from Randy Whitman at the beginning of the 08-09 season to Kevin McHale, who finished out the year, and then from Kevin McHale to Kurt Rambis the following season. Yep. So that's where you're getting the triangle from. Yeah, I think that's what I was going to say too, Connor, is like we're looking at a systemic failure. There are teams that, for whatever reason, talked themselves out of a certain guy or made picks that were really sort of contradictory to one another. And I think that that's a really interesting thing that still to this day happens. The perfect example of this is you look at Marvin Bagley. And I love Bagley. I'm as big a Bagley defender as there is out there. But Bagley needs a lot of special things to succeed. He needs a rim protector who can space the floor. And you look at Luka, and I'm not going to try and, say we had Luka number one and we were very high on Luka, but he fits into a lot of rosters. This is a guy who comes in, he plays basketball well, he knows how to play the game the right way, and he raises the floor. Now, he also raises the ceiling, but he immediately raises the floor. And I think it's really interesting when you look at things like this and you see an organization that doesn't quite have a grasp on the personnel that they have in-house, and they just sort of are adding willy-nilly. And we talked about this last week when we talked about the process, that sometimes you're looking to trade an asset. You're trying to pick a player because you think, oh, here is a player who's the best player available and will carry the highest weight. But getting 70 cents on a dollar in any trade is like pretty good. I mean, you're never going to get value for value in those things. And I think that drafting a player, BPA, who you can't maximize, like Josh said, who you can't put in a position to succeed because he is a pick and roll guard, who's a little bit undersized, who needs the movement on the offense to create space, like all this stuff. It's just really a bad move. And I'm not really reinventing the wheel here, because everybody knows the famous Kirk screaming Khan at the projector thing from Star Trek 2. But this is just a very weird choice, and this continues to go on where you have owners who weigh into things to sell tickets or whatever. But I don't think this is a new thing that's developed, and obviously we've seen it 10 years ago, so it's something that still sort of affects basketball to this day.
Yeah, I would say that's probably pretty fair. I think that maybe another thing that I sort of thought about, and I don't really know how true this is maybe we didn't sort of value IQ as much as we should at the time, because a lot of the offenses were very post-centric and there wasn't a lot of movement involved in a lot of them. So there wasn't really a need to have strong help side defenders or players that could read and react off screens and all this stuff that makes so many players so valuable today that may not have had the same value to others.
Yeah. And I think, that point it sort of plays itself out when you look at the next pick, because you bring Steph Curry into a system where Monta Ellis already is. And there was a lot of questions about whether Monta Ellis could play with Steph Curry really early on. I mean, Curry fought through some injuries and he dealt with a lot of things. And of course, it all worked out for the Warriors because he signed that low extension. But it was a player who was brought in who there were legitimate concerns about, and he exceeded well beyond what we projected him, but he also overcame the things in such a way that it's really hard. When you're looking at a guy with chronic ankle injuries, this is an injury that can overcome people, can ruin careers, can make a guy lose a step. He goes and he gets this unorthodox, core strength conditioning coach, and he learns to strengthen the parts of his body in his calf or in his feet. He learns how to balance, which is something that people weren't really, there was a lot of flexibility conditioning 10 years ago as compared to what you see now. And so I think it's really interesting when you look at Steph Curry about how many things went right for him. Whereas in a lot of situations, things could have gone wrong, and Curry could have never been the player that we know today. But I don't know what, I'm not trying to bring this into some greater philosophical point, except to say that it's really interesting that Curry succeeded when so much was stacked against him to fail.
For sure. And the other funny thing, we mentioned that Memphis wanted him. Part of the thing with Minnesota not drafting him is they did really love Jonny Flynn. Thank you, 6 overtime game. But Steph and his dad Dell were actively telling Minnesota and Golden State not to draft him. He did not want to go there. He wanted to wind up with the Knicks. And on top of that, the Warriors actually backed out of an agreed upon deal with the Phoenix Suns for that 7th pick. It would have been Stoudemire and I think their pick at I want to say 14 for that 7th pick because Phoenix was really high on Steph. And the second the time came in for them to actually make that trade, Golden State was like, you know what, we're keeping him. So in regards to this draft class and Steph Curry in particular, there were so many different ways this could have gone. And then you allude to, the ankle issues and all of that sort of stuff. Steph really has had what we mentioned before, like a black swan type career where you really couldn't have predicted a lot of how this played out.
Let's go on and talk about some of the other guys in this draft. We didn't get to touch on DeMar DeRozan, unfortunately, a player who is sort of anachronistic even now, but that's a really interesting discussion to have at some other time. But I want to touch on some of the other guys as you look down this draft board. There are a lot of really nice contributors, even guys like Gerald Henderson, who was a contributor early. You find Damari Carroll, what was there he is, Juwan Blair. There are guys in this draft, Giannis Jerebko, who are still contributing on teams today, Danny Green at 46 and Patty Mills at 55. And then you go and you look and you see Aaron Baines undrafted in this class, Joe Ingles undrafted in this class, Wesley Matthews, Milos Teodosic. This was a good class outside of the top 10 and put a lot of quality players. I know, Josh, you had some stuff to talk about when it came to the lower draftees and the undrafted guys.
Well, you mentioned a lot of them. Another thing, and I think Eustacchio had a point about this too, this draft class was kind of really stocked with point guards. We mentioned Harden already. Harden was a nominal 2 guard, same with Tyreek, but in essence, they were point guards. Ricky Rubio, Jonny Flynn, Steph Curry, Brandon Jennings, Drew Holiday, Ty Lawson, Jeff Teague, Darren Collison, even Rodwick Boubois had a nice solid little run with Dallas. Then Sergio Llull was drafted in the 2nd round. He never came over and never will. Respect to him for that decision. As well as Patrick Beverly. Nick Kalathis has gone on to have a pretty good European career. So Patty Mills, you mentioned at 55, even Nando DeColo has been playing really well overseas. This draft class was really stock full of point guard talent, along with a lot of really good players, like you mentioned with Damari Carroll, Wayne Ellington. Taj Gibson is another guy that came out of this draft class. DeJuan Blair and Connor's guy Chase Buttinger. There have been it was a very interesting draft class.
Yeah, building on the point about the depth of the point guards in this class, I think that's really interesting from a draft theory standpoint. You look at the top 10 and there were all those creators, 4 point guards plus Tyreek, Harden, and also even Blake Griffin at 1 was a great creator for a big man. So that's 7 creators in the top 10. And then after that, there was a lull where 11 to 16 was mostly wings, forwards, bigs. which allowed 4 great point guards to fall to the 17 to 21 range: Drew Holiday, Lawson, Teague, and Collison. Between those 4 players, they've started 1,900 games at the point guard position in the NBA. And so if you think about that from a draft theory standpoint, although after 16 picks, there were, I believe, 4 point guards, 4 wings, 4 forwards, 4 bigs picked, it was balanced from a positional point of view. And sometimes we think about our rankings like the 3rd best big in the class or the 5th best wing, but you have to really examine how the quality of that positional depth. Sometimes it's better to have the 8th or 9th best point guard than the 3rd best big man. And so something I'll be thinking about moving forward is how to apply that lesson to this draft class and what positions really have the most depth, which ones even the 2nd or 3rd best player may not be worth all that much, and try to analyze the distribution of talent the best we can.
I think you bring up that really interesting point about like the 10th best of each position is not necessarily created equal, that the 10th best point guard and the 10th best big man aren't necessarily created equal. And I think that's something that when you kind of think about things without really diving into the depth of it, can sort of be like on the surface a little bit more confusing. Is that like, yeah, he's the 10th best point guard, but he also might be the 15th or 17th best player in the draft. And I think that draft composition is something that has a ton of impact on what happens, but it's something we tend not to think of all that often. We thought of it last year a lot because that draft class was loaded with big men at the top. But by and large, that's something that kind of gets forgotten a lot, is that the context of breaking down a class is really important when it comes to the depth of any position. But anyway, guys, that's all the time we have today. Thanks for laboring through it with us and listening to the 2009 draft class. There's so much. I honestly felt like we could have done 45 more minutes, 55 more minutes, and just gone through every pick and talked about the fit and was it the right fit and look at the roster. It's fun to kind of look back on these classes that have had so much impact on the league, but we'll save any more of that discussion for another time. So before we go, Connor, do you have anything you want to get a plug in for this week?
Yeah, I got a new piece up on the 94 feet about sort of the first 2 games each that I broke down of Bol and Charles Bassey, sort of some first impressions of them. I'm probably going to try to get another one out like that. Haven't really decided who it's going to be on. And then sort of coming up, I'm going to take a sort of time break where I watch all NBA for a week and sort of see what I can take away from that.
I can't wait for that. I want to see I want there to be like a running diary of everything you think during that week. Make sure to follow Connor at Harr Connor on Twitter. He definitely brings the draft insight, and we love that. Josh, what about you, man?
I just want to further pimp Connor's work and be on the lookout for the next installments of Eustacchio's Draft Thoughts and Alex's Hoop Think. All of these guys do amazing stuff. Really give each of them a follow. Be on the lookout for their articles and their columns and stuff, because they know their stuff and they put out good content.
Well, thank you, Josh. You used your time to pimp all the rest of us, so we appreciate that. Eustacchio, speaking of a column, what can we look forward to this week in Draft Thoughts?
So I think I may expand further on the topic of the depth at a position in a draft. Like this draft was famous for point guards last year, for bigs, how we can apply those lessons to this year. And I'm also, in my other work, I'm going to start getting some early thoughts on paper about the top prospects in this draft class. I'll be doing that from a Cavalier point of view over at the Basketball Indexed, but you can look for that series to start up in the next couple of days.
Fantastic. Follow Eustacchio on Twitter at EVR1022. And I am writing this week. It seems like we're all writing companion pieces to this pod. I'm actually breaking down what I talked about with Steph Curry and a little bit of how unconventional his approach to his rehabilitation was, and how that unconventional approach really made the Warriors who they were, and how they helped him rehab that. And by by virtue of helping him become the player that he is today, helped create one of the best dynasties that we've seen in the modern era. So I'm going to take a look at how an unconventional approach can sometimes change the game. And so it seems like we're all writing companion pieces. You can follow me on Twitter at AlexWestNBA. You can follow Red Team Scouting on Twitter at Red Team Scouting. We have some really exciting news that we're not 100% ready to roll out yet, but just know that there is exciting news coming up. We can't wait to let you know. The draft guide, if you're familiar with what we did last year for the 94, it is on the way. It's going to be different this year. We're trying a whole different approach, and we can't wait to roll it out for you. But just know we've got exciting news coming up. So thanks for listening. We always appreciate it. We appreciate all the feedback we've gotten from everybody on Twitter, sending us messages, enjoying our discussion. So we can't wait to hear from you guys further. Let us know what you want us to talk about. If you want us to expand on something, or you want us to speak about something in particular, send us your thoughts. Hit any one of us up on Twitter. Hit the Red Team Scouting up on Twitter, and just let people know what it is you want to listen to. So anyway, for the Red Team Draft Podcast, I am Alex West, and I will see you guys next week.